So in this chapter of the book, chapter 9, what I do is I introduce a theory of how the introduction of an informing system in a complex environment can actually change the behavior of that environment and shrink our time horizons. And this is important because one of the major challenges businesses often refer to is that challenge of keeping time horizons long enough so that we do not make stupid short-term decisions, of which we see very many in today's environment. So the organization of this chapter presentation is, first we'll take a look at some of the sources of real-world complexity. This is something that's just a review of the previous chapter. Then we'll look at how the introduction of information technology and the expansion of our informing systems to make them global actually impacts this overall environment through impacting real-world complexity. We will then look at this in terms of the power law concept that we talked about in the last chapter. We'll talk about the notion of black swans and gray swans, these infrequent events that have a major impact on environmental behavior. And then we'll talk about some of the implications for education and management. To review quickly, when we talk about real-world complexity, there are almost three things that are always mentioned as being sources of this complexity. The first is the number of elements in the system, or in the case of fitness, the number of attributes that impact fitness. The second is the degree of interaction between elements or attributes. And then finally, we have the rate at which they interact with each other and which the overall dynamics of the system change. And what happens in an evolutionary system is these things impact each other. For example, as the number of elements in the system changes, the rate of change can also occur at the same time. So what we need to remember as we move forward is that whenever you change the number of elements, how rapidly they interact and how many other elements they interact with, you are ultimately going to change the dynamics of the system, and that will tend to lead to increased turbulence and increased ruggedness, which is to say more and more combinations that lead to fitness peaks will develop, as well as many more combinations that are not peaks. So let's begin by thinking about how IT might change an informing system or change the balance. Now, if you have less IT in a system, you're going to have to rely more heavily on things like intuition and practice, these key things that are a part of expertise. As the amount of IT increases, you are going to tend to rely more heavily on rules and procedures, because those are the types of things you can code in an IT system. You can effectively manage much more communications. In a real sense, that's what the internet does for you. And you're also going to tend to be more dependent on models of how the world works. Framed in terms of the complexity theory that we have talked about, what we're effectively doing when we add IT is we are moving our task so that it is more heavily dependent upon the problem space. So we're depending less on experience complexity and more on problem space complexity. And moving things over to the problem space offers us a number of advantages. It allows us to better observe and control the processes we're dealing with, because the problem space will typically allow us to measure things. It will allow us to be guided through complex or complicated procedures. When you think about a program like TurboTax, for example, it makes it possible for someone like me, who really doesn't understand all the intricacies of the tax law, to prepare his own income tax return, because TurboTax basically takes me through the whole process step by step. Another thing that it does is it provides us with access to expertise. When I was doing my doctorate, I studied expert systems. TurboTax, you could argue, is like an expert system because it provides me access to reasonably expert advice And of course, the internet and search does this all the time. Finally, it facilitates our communications with others. It's even hard to imagine these days how we could exist without email, answering machines, text messaging for younger folks, the telephone, and so forth. All of these things involve information technology, and all of it reduce the cost of communicating with others. Now, the interesting thing about introducing these technologies is it helps produce what is sometimes referred to as a cybernetic loop, which is to say a loop that feeds back on itself. So how does this loop actually work? Well, we start with the use of information technology, and as we already talked about on the previous page, it increases our ability to communicate and connect with others. It makes it easier to involve a larger number of participants, and it dramatically reduces our reaction time. We can see things much, much faster. You know, you compare technology today with what was there in the 17th century. In the 17th century, if you were lucky, the old world and the new world could communicate with 2-month gaps in between. Now it is a fraction of a second. So if you think about the sources of complexity, which is to say the number of individuals we're connected to, the number of participants in the system, and how quickly they react to each other, IT essentially lays the groundwork for increased system complexity. So real-world complexity grows, and with that complexity we can expect to see increased turbulence, and we can see increased ruggedness, because ultimately this larger number of participants and this ability to communicate with them creates new possible high fitness combinations as well as many possible low fitness combinations. So real-world complexity starts to grow. Now, as real-world complexity starts to grow, the complexity that we experience grows as the dynamics of the environment move faster and faster, and we get more turbulence. All of a sudden, we're more frequently encountering unfamiliar situations. We're encountering uncertainty. We're encountering ambiguity as a result of all this. So what do? We seek to reduce our experience complexity. Remember that experience complexity is something that you like to have in the middle of that inverted U. You don't want too little experience complexity. That's boring. It causes you to become distracted, and you don't want too much because that leads to information overload. So all of a sudden, what we start looking for is better models and ways that we can offload some of that complexity to the problem space. Well, when we offload it to the problem space, our demand for information technology grows, because information technology is the perfect tool for moving what we experience into the problem space. So we start to use more data, we start to communicate more rapidly, we start to use our technologies for decision support, and that leads to increasing IT use, growing real-world complexity, experience complexity grows, we reduce it with information technology, and we just keep cycling around and around and around. I have sometimes referred to this using a term my father developed as the fundamental predicament of progress, which is that as complexity grows, we find ourselves increasingly looking at the short term because we can't manage the long term. If we look at these phenomena in terms of the power law, what we could argue is that as we introduce information technology and increase the number of elements in the system and how quickly they react to each other in the system, what happens is the power law curve moves out, which means that we're going to have even more small high-frequency events, but at the same time, the potential for really large events is going to grow because the system size has gotten larger, and so we are not truncated by system size. So if you look at what happened in the financial crisis that occurred back in 2007, 2008, essentially the way we'd analyze this in power law terms is because everything was so connected and because there were so many connected elements, it allowed the disruption that that occurred during that point to be much, much larger than if these systems were isolated from each other. Now, what I have described is what Nassim Taleb might refer to as a gray swan. And by a gray swan, what I mean is a discontinuity that exists within a particular system. So that if you have a complex system, you can expect a certain number of disruptions. Not surprisingly, these disruptions often follow a power law distribution in terms of size. So every once in a while, you're going to get a really big one. But within the system, the disruptions are limited by the size of the system. So that's what's known as the gray swan. Now, it's also possible to have what Taleb refers to as a black swan. And in the case of a black swan, what you're dealing with is you're dealing with disruptions that occur from outside of the entire system. And of course, that's much, much easier if your system that you're looking at has more and more connections to these external systems, so that as the government becomes more interconnected with the private sector, as the global economy becomes more connected with the national economy, it becomes possible for events in these outer sectors to have a greater influence on the industry. And that is what Taleb refers to as a black swan, which is to say an unpredicted, unforeseeable event that occurs from outside the system you're looking at instead of from inside. And if you may recall an earlier example I talked about in the case of the casino, the things that put the casino out of business were not the threats they predicted, randomness or theft. It was things they did not predict, like a tiger eating one of their performers. From a practical standpoint, what all this means is that in a highly complex world, as you increase the number of elements, the reactivity to each other, and the degree of interconnectedness, the vulnerability to discontinuous change increases. The way economists like to predict the world, they like to imagine things occur as a continuous change. But in the world of complexity, you may end up in the same place, but the road is going to have these punctuations, these periods when the world appears orderly, followed by sudden shifts of behavior. And if you look at a business, the place where you can really make some money is being in the right place during these orderly periods, because that's when you can tune to a fitness peak and do very well exploiting that peak. Then when you have these punctuations, these sudden changes, the whole world changes. I know a really good example of a company, Battery Marsh Financial Management, which started in the 1960s with a contrarian philosophy. They were one of the first online trading companies. Now, at that time, online wasn't the internet. People connected to it sort of by modem. But at any rate, between the period of like 1967 to 1981, they had an incredible track record. They outpaced virtually every other investment management fund out there. And as a result, they attracted lots and lots of pensions. And they did this entirely through their efficient computer modeling. What happened then, though, was around 1981, as they reached their peak assets, they managed to accomplish something equally remarkable. For the next 10 years, they managed to get beaten every year. Why? Because they had a philosophy and algorithms based upon assumptions of one set of orderly behavior. But around 1982, the stock market changed its behavior, and suddenly the contrarian models were much, much less useful than models that just predicted continuing growth. And this is the challenge with complexity. You can tune to an orderly period, but you can't really tune or predict to disruptions, which means the shorter the orderly period, in a sense, the shorter the time horizons of someone who's trying to manage to achieve optimums during these smooth periods. So all this can sort of be framed into a theory of increasing complexity. And I refer to this as a theory, and part of the point of this chapter was to show how, using some basic assumptions, you can come up with theories of your own. But the basic idea of this theory is as follows. We as individuals are motivated by control, but in a turbulent environment, really the only periods that we can feel in control are those periods of order between the turbulence. So the more turbulent the environment, the more frequent the disruptions, the more we have to control for the short term as opposed to the long term. So let's sort of frame this in a more formal way. So if we take a look, as real-world complexity grows, our time horizons tend to shrink. As real-world complexity is going to increase our experience complexity, it is going to encourage us to rely on IT and expand our horizons. It allows us to increase both the system size and the speed. All of these allow us to adapt more quickly as turbulence occurs, but they feed back to shorter time horizons and ultimately greater turbulence, more gray swans, potentially more black swans as the size of the system grows, more increased real-world complexity, and so forth. And in a system like this, it's not entirely clear how you can accommodate the effects of complexity, but one thing that is very clear is that if you're going to survive on a system like this, you need to be highly adaptable.